Joyce, how are you? Are you? Unmute, mute, unmute. Unmute. You're still muted.
Okay.
There you
Better today. Thank you. Water came on this morning, so I feel like a new person.
Really, I know.
Wow.
Yeah. Shower and everything.
Did you have any damage?
No, I didn't. It's the apartment. All of the apartments in this block went out of water and I don't know, electricity. I was at my son's for 5 or 6 days, but you know, it just wasn't home. Everything closed. He didn't have water and electricity for a while, but he had a gas stove, so we were able to eat at least.
Yeah.
Food.
Wow.
But, yeah, and it was better to be with company. You know?
Yes.
It was frightening
definitely.
to be alone and all of that going on.
Yeah.
Joyce, it's good to see you.
Good to see everyone.
It's good to be here.
It is.
Yeah.
I don't know you, Connie. I'm Iris Fisherman.
Hi, Iris. I've seen you around for a while
You look familiar.
at Brit Shalom.
Yeah.
Right.
A year or more ago. Yes.
Hi, Connie. You have a face.
Hello, Suzanne. Hi, Rhoda. Hi, Glory.
Good morning or afternoon,
Hi,
all.
Sandy.
afternoon.
Hi, Iris, Joyce,
Yeah.
Sarah.
Hello,
Everybody else.
Everyone,
Sharon.
Good
Kulon.
to see everyone.
I've been on Zoom since 9:30 this morning.
Oh, really?
You're a busy
New
woman, Sarah.
lifestyle.
What can I
A
say?
new lifestyle. A new lifestyle.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Oh, yeah. Well,
What do you
Hello,
do?
hello.
You never actually don't have to.
All right, I'm going to ask everybody to mute,
okay.
and we will get started. Apologize for the delay, a couple technical difficulties. All right, so we're here this week. Is a week of Purim, and it's good to see everybody. I think this is a week in which we need a little bit of frivolity in the midst of all the chaos of our world. So let's take a little bit of look. The good news is I've got a very farcical text to play with here to help you in that process. So at first glance, it's easy to dismiss the book of Esther as belonging to a kind of extravagant storytelling. You might think of the Arabian Nights, 1001 Nights, that comes out of a different world. You have at the very beginning of the text an opening chapter in which an entire kingdom, an entire city rather, has 180-day drunken feast. You cannot imagine that there's a lot of business going on in such a world. As a matter of fact, if you remember later in the story, when Achashverosh can't sleep, what does he do? He has his record of all the events of the city that have been brought to him to help him sleep. They'll read him to what's going on in the city so he can fall asleep. Not much is going on. All right. It's a lot of drunkenness, and you'll see that throughout the text. The book of Esther is written in a burlesque fashion, populated with exaggerated character types. There are coincidences, there are improbabilities, there's verbal humor, there's satire. It's a bizarre book in a lot of ways. Such a text presents the rabbis with a number of embarrassing problems to deal with. How can a nice Jewish girl like Esther marry a Gentile king? And one rabbi, you can see their problem with it. One rabbi proposes that the use of a doppelganger who replaced her in the marital bed. All right. How does she maintain any kind of normal religious practices such as eating kosher food while in the palace? And again, the rabbis are playing. Some of the rabbis credited her with inventing an ingenious method to enable her to keep track of when is Shabbat, she would have 7 serving girls, each one day a week. And so when the right girl came up, she knew it was Shabbat. Clearly, the rabbis are playing because they recognize a problem here. Perhaps the most blatant response that shows you the difficulties of the text is what Rabbah's teaching of the famous dictum that when Megillah Esther is read, it's one's duty to become so drunk, so inebriated, that you can't tell the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordecai. It's more likely that inebriation would allow the readers of the Megillah to gloss over the broad humor and hijinks, as well as the improbability of most of the facts of the book. Okay, so you've got a lot of issues that present themselves right at the start. Now, traditionalists would not be happy with me in saying this. However, they have some problems really to deal with. The first thing is there's no mention of God anywhere in this text. So how would they respond? And you'll see their playfulness in this process as well. Not only there's no God, there's no Jewish observance, there's no prayer. So, and if you look, by the way, at the Greek version of the text, and it's in the Septuagint, and we'll talk about that in a little while, it's a far more religious text. Things have been changed to add a religious tone to the book of Esther. In our text version, however, Mordecai suggests that if Esther doesn't take action, then there'll be a rescue of the Jews from another place. Well, the word place in this case is makom. And of course, the rabbis pick up on makom being placed as hamakom, the place, but it's also one of the rabbinic names for God. So there's this hiding of God's name in the text. Another example of that hiding is that you'll see in certain verses, like chapter 5, verse 4, there are words the rabbis play with, where if you take the first letter of 4 consecutive words, there's a phrase, Yavo HaMelech v'Haman Hayom, it spells out Yod He Vav He, God's name. It's hidden there, but the rabbis are playing. It's clear. All right, and then of course they go back and they go back to Deuteronomy and say, it was foretold there. Because there's a phrase there that says in Deuteronomy 31, Anochi haster aser panai, which basically my face will be hidden. Well, there's your prediction about the book of Esther. God's name will be hidden. They're being creative because it's not there. Plain and simply, it's not there. As a result, the book's inclusion and its importance has been debated since rabbinic times. In the Talmud, there are discussions as to whether or not Esther, quote, defiles the hands, which means basically they're saying, should it even be in the Bible? Or is it a text that defiles the Bible? Modern scholar Samuel Sandmill writes that he would not be grieved if the book of Esther were somehow dropped out of the Bible entirely. And even such traditionalists as H.L. Ginsburg stated that God's name is not and could not be included in such a farcical text. So you've got an awful lot of people struggling. I've got a paper due that I'm supposed to write for a class in which I'm supposed to present the traditional perspective on the historicity of this text versus the farcical. I can almost find no resources as to the historical nature of this text. I don't know how I'm going to write this paper. I've just written to the professor to say, help me. I can't find anything in all the journal articles I've researched. It's also, on top of that, the only biblical book that when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's no mention of it. Now, some suggest that this absence reflects the ideological concerns of the Qumran community about the context of the book, that there's no mention of God, and that's speculation. Traditionalists might point at a different perspective and say that if you know about the Dead Sea community, they didn't observe Purim at all. Why? They had a 364, not 365, a 364-day calendar, which meant that Purim would always fall out on Shabbat, And if that's the case, you've got a conflict of observance. You can't observe Purim on Shabbat, so Purim never got observed. You see the shenanigans. You see the responses of the rabbis and the leadership to find a way to somehow make it legit. All that, all right, at the same time, there's an entire tractate of the Mishnah that is designated to this one book. You have, it is laws regulating the writing of the scroll, laws regulating how it is to be read in public. For Jews today, it's the most well-known biblical tale. All right. What book is followed by Jews with more intensity than the book of Esther, as you sit there waiting to hear the magical word and everybody goes, whoa, clamor, clamor, clamor. All right, because you hear the magical word. We teach this to the kids from the moment they walk into a classroom. Oh, you got to make noise, Haman, bad. So everybody follows this book with an intensity most people would never follow any other biblical reading. All right, so I've presented the case for the farce, and now let's study a little bit. All right, there's a serious side to the text as well. As funny as the characters are, they're acted out against a dark background of the threat of genocide of the entire Jewish people. And thus the book speaks directly to the reality of Jewish life in the exile, in the diaspora. An author I came across, Sydney Ann White, proposes, she says the following: Esther is the true heroine of the tale, and the traits in her character and her actions that make her successful are those that a Jew must emulate if he or she is to be successful in the precarious world of the diaspora. Esther essentially learns to make her way around among the powerful and to cooperate with others in order to create a secure world for herself. She's far from passive. She's a model for success in an uncertain world. White follows that up. The author says she succeeds by learning to gain power by working within the structure rather than against, a model for successful and fulfilling life in the diaspora. I'm trying to get rid of this. Why? You can't go away. Okay, it's gone. All right. I want to also take a few minutes and connect the story of Esther to other biblical tales. The book of Esther is firmly related to biblical characters which precede her and events which precede her. It's clear that the author of this text was trying to make a bridge. The most obvious model for Esther and Mordecai is the figure of Joseph. Joseph rises to great heights in a foreign court of a king and uses that opportunity to save his people. Both Joseph and Esther are praised for their beauty. And I ask you to take a look at text one. I hope you've run off the text in advance. For those of you who don't know, when I teach, I much rather see faces than project the text on the screen. So I ask people to be able to run it off in advance. If you look at text one, I've given you two verses, one from Genesis and one from Esther. In Genesis, Vayehi Yosef Yefei Toar V'Yefei Mareh. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And in Esther, you have the feminized version, V'Hanna Ara Yefat Toar V'Tovat Mareh. She's nice to look at. She's good to look at. All right. So you have parallel verses describing similar situations.
Hey, Mark, you have somebody in the waiting room.
Ah, thank you. I gotta find the waiting room. All right. I apologize. Ah, here we go. It went away. Oh, there we go. It all. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. So you've got those two verses. You have another thread that goes even deeper here in terms of Haman is described as an Agagite, as Agag. All right. And you're immediately drawn to previous tales in the Bible. For example, we had the Haftarah, which we just read this past Shabbat from the book of Samuel, tasked with destroying the Amalekites and their king by God. And the Amalekites, the king is Agag. Saul spares the king despite the command, and he allows the people to take the spoils. For this failure, Samuel effectively removes the kingdom from Saul and places it instead on the shoulders of David. And if you look at text 2, you'll see the phrase Samuel uses in text 2, in the first one, Kira Adonai et mamlechut Yisrael me'alecha hayom u'tana l'reyecha hatov mimeka. The Lord has this day torn the kingship over Israel away from you and has given it to another who is worthier than you. In Esther, you have the same story, and bestow her royal state upon another who is more worthy than she. That's in the story of Vashti. Again, you see the parallel of wording, very deliberate. Moreover, in the case of Esther, it's explicitly stated that Jews did not take the spoils. Remember, Samuel allowed them to take the spoils from the Agagites, and here Esther does not, after their victory, and this is meant to contrast the two episodes. And thus, in one sense, Agag the Amalekite, who is spared by Saul, is finally killed along with all his offsprings at the hand of Mordecai, who is a descendant of Kish, who was the father of Saul. So you see these connections in terms of how this is being written. The failure of the past is being corrected in the present, and it is meant to convey to you a sense of the hand of history playing out. Goes even further back. One is reminded, if you go back, we read this week, reading Exodus, the Amalekites attack the Israelites from the rear, where the stragglers are, where the weakest are. And as a result, we're told in Exodus that God will have an eternal war with Amalek throughout the generations. And when it picks up in Deuteronomy, the story, which we did just read as the maftir this week, again, not an accident, the rabbis picked it on purpose. There's a command to Israel that when they are at rest, when they rest in the land, timcheh et zecher Amalek, to blot out the memory of Amalek from under the heavens. One more going back, and here's a little bit of play, but play with me. In the patriarchal history, Amalek is understood as the grandson of Esau. Now, the timing of 400 years doesn't play very well here, but nonetheless, that's the understanding of tradition through the son, all right? And this in turn takes us back to Jacob's betrayal of Esau when he steals the blessing. Why connect the story? Look at text 3. In Genesis, you have Vayitzak Tze'aka Gedola, and he cries out this great cry, this bitter cry, Umara Ad Me'od. And yet you find the identical words to describe Mordecai's cry about Haman's plot, Vayizak Ze'aka Gedola Umara. Now you'll notice that Tzadi has been replaced by a Zion, which is a common biblical issue, but nonetheless, it's the same meaning of the words. What they're trying to show you and what they're trying to display here is that ultimately the problems of the past between the Jews and the Amalekites are being resolved in the story of Purim, in the story of Esther. Any comments, thoughts at this point? Okay. Let's go to point 2, issue 2, Christianity and anti-Semitism. Until recently, Christian Bible scholars used the book of Esther to express anti-Semitic sentiments, such as describing this book as the product of a nationalistic spirit seeking revenge upon those who persecute the Jews. The whole ending of this book, if you look at chapter 9, is about Jews taking vengeance upon those who threaten to kill them. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia says, reading 1. Joyce, do you have the readings? You've got square 1, so you're on. Would you do reading 1 for us?
Sure. The opponents of the Book of Esther may undoubtedly boast that Martin Luther headed the attack. In his table talk, he declared that he was so hostile to the Book of Esther that I would not exist, for it Judaizes too much and hazarded a great deal of heathenish naughtiness, unquote. His remark in his reply to Erasmus shows that this was his deliberate judgment. Referring to Esther, he says that, though the Jews have it in their canon, quote, it is more worthy than all, unquote, the apocryphal books, quote, of being excluded from the canon, unquote.
Major fan. He's a Jew fan. Martin Luther, for sure.
Yeah.
All right. I now want to take a different look at it. I want to take a sort of a literary look at this text. And I want to look at what's called a chiastic structure. A chiastic structure is a literary device in which there are ideas presented in parallel ways so that you have what the best way to remember it is A, B, B, A. There's a parallel between the first 2 points, and then there's a parallel between the points in between. Okay. Scholars often see this as sort of a literary curiosity, an artistry, but some suggest it has no meaning for the text. But others show indeed that it probably does. And what it implies is that there is an intentional process in the writing of the book, that it's not merely a random accretion of materials. And so it could be a single author who's putting this together. It also could be the work of a redactionist at a later point who's taking it and creating the structure for the text. In the case of Esther, there's very good reason to believe that there is a chiasm in existence. The first and most persuasive clue is the parallelism between scenes at the beginning and the end of the narrative. The story begins with an introduction. It's an introduction to Ahasuerus's vast realm, and it ends with a summary of Ahasuerus's reign and a synopsis of Mordecai's administration. But it's the next pair of scenes that is significant. Esther chapter 1, verse 3 in the next section. The king throws 2 feasts, one for the nobles and the military leaders of Persia, and then another one for all the citizens within the fortress of the city of Susa. The penultimate scene of the book also has 2 fasts, a Jewish celebration of Purim in the Persian provinces and the celebration in Susa a day later. In addition, both of these scenes feature the queen's involvement in the feasting. Queen Vashti gives a private feast for the women alone in chapter 1, and Queen Esther gives the order establishing the Purim feast in chapter 9. There are 2 essential elements that play out in this text throughout. 1, feasts. There are 11 different feasts described in the book of Esther. This is a party community. This is college. All right? This is college time. Party, 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 party. This, all right? Now, one of the reasons for this can be that it's providing an ideological foundation for the celebration of Purim. It is not an accident that Purim happens at the same time as Mardi Gras. The beginning of spring was a time of parties throughout the world. And so what you may have here is a text that takes it and superimposes new meaning upon a previously existing custom. So parties and feasts, one major theme. The second is the structural device of reversal. There are numerous significant reversals in this text that are evident mostly sometimes when it's clear that it's in one episode. So for example, in Esther 6, Haman's attempt to have Mordecai executed results in the villain being forced to honor Mordecai instead. I'm going to bring to you a chiastic model. Let me let somebody in here. All right. Chiastic model presented by a non-Jew by the name of Anthony Tomasino, in which he presents a comprehensive structural basis for this text. He proposes that Esther consists of 13 main scenes surrounded by an introduction and a conclusion, And I want you to keep, there's a page here that looks like that, if you can see it. All right, I want you to keep that in front of you. It has A, B, C, D, E, F, G in red, and then you'll see G prime, F prime, E prime through the page. Keep that in front of you as we go through this next section of analysis. All right. All right, so I started with, we're on the second one. I gave you the introduction, the structures of the kingdoms, etc. We're now on B and B prime. The second and the penultimate scenes, in addition to the two feasts, also share several vocabulary items, days, provinces, and writings, and each section closes with a decree and with letters that are sent throughout the entire Persian Empire. In B, Esther 1, you have Vayishlach Sifarim El Kol Medinot. Dispatches were sent to all provinces. In B prime, you have Vayishlach Sifarim El Kol HaYehudim. Dispatches are sent to all the Jews. In B, we learn the reason for Vashti's downfall, which created the circumstances whereby Esther becomes queen. In B prime, at the end of the text, the circumstances surrounding Haman's downfall are recounted, and it leads to the promotion of Mordecai. All right, that's B and B prime. Let's jump to C. We'll keep playing. There's a basic thematic similarity between the third and the 13th section, C and C prime, which recount the triumph of the Jews over Gentile rivals. So these triumphs are expressed in synonymous but not necessarily identical terms. All right, in Esther, look at text 6. You have chapter 2, Vayamlicheha Tachat Vashti. She replaces Vashti. And in the Hebrew, he made her a queen instead of Vashti. And then in chapter 9, Asher Yishlatu. Yishlatu is rule instead of king. She rules. It's a different word for ruling. Ha-Yehudim Hema Besonehem. The Jews got their enemies in their dominion, in their power. There are similar circumstances which accompany these victories. In chapter 2, Esther is aided by the king's eunuch to overcome her rivals. In 9, all of the king's officials come to aid the Jews in their triumph over their enemies. And both triumphs result in feasts. Okay, C. Let's jump to D. If you have any questions, I'm open. Okay, D. Seeing D and D prime. In D, Mordecai learns about a plot against the king, and he foils it with the aid of Esther, who reveals the conspiracy to the king. The conspirators are punished with impaling. Vayitlu shnehem al eitz. The two were impaled on stakes. By the way, I do want to, we often translate this as hanging, but it's not hanging in the way we understand of a noose. It's hanging in the sense the person was killed and then publicly impaled high above so that people could see them hung. Okay, so it's really about impaling, not hanging. So Vayitlushnehem, the two were impaled on stakes. In chapter 8, the D prime, Mordecai foils the plot of Haman, again through Esther's intervention with the king. And at the end of the scene, the king recounts his order that the conspirator Haman be impaled. Ve'oto tilu al ha'etz. He has been impaled on the stake. There's also an ironic reversal connecting the scenes. Scene D begins with a note that Esther had not reported her kinship with Mordecai. She hadn't told anybody that she's Jewish. But at the end of D prime, she does reveal her relationship to Mordecai, to the king. And you see this here in text 8, Ein Esther Mageret, Moladata Vietama. Esther did not reveal her kindred or her people. And then in 8, Kihigida, and you see the parallels of the words. I've highlighted certain words so that you can see the parallels. Kihigida Esther et Mahula. For Esther had revealed how he was related to her. Very deliberate play on words here. E, let's play with E, and we're just getting closer and closer to the central scenes. In the next scene, the threat that will confront the Jews begins. In E, the villain of the story, our good friend Haman, is introduced. He is the personal embodiment of the Jews' troubles. In the parallel, E prime, this villain will be removed from the picture as he is sent to his execution. There is a revealing of ethnicity in each scene. In chapter 3, Haman had discovered the ethnicity of Mordecai. In the prime, in E prime, Esther reveals her Jewishness to King and Haman. They both have potential and ultimately fatal results. Haman's information incites him to sentence all the Jews to death. Esther's leads to Haman's death sentence. All right, you see in text 9, there's 3 verses here, and I'll just read the English. You can see where the parallels are in the Hebrew. Having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to do away with all the Jews. Esther 7, and if it pleases your majesty, let my life be granted as my wish and my people as my request. So she's identifying herself as those are her people. A stake is standing at Haman's house, 75 feet high. Okay, 75 feet. All right, that is not to hang somebody with a noose. You don't need 75 feet. Okay, and which Haman made for Mordecai, the man whose words saved the king. Impale him on it, the king ordered. There are other reversals in E as well. Haman is filled with chema, with fury because of Mordecai. E prime, it is the king who is furious, chema, with Haman. You have Haman is filled with rage in chapter 3, and the king in his fury left the wine feast, and the king's fury abated in chapter 7. Again, these words are not, one can say it's all accidental, all right, but we're not finding hidden meaning like I was suggesting earlier. We're finding clear literary devices that are being used. All right. Looking at text 11, in E, Haman has been raised up by the king. It says, Gidal HaMelech. He's been made great. He's been made Gadol. Achashverosh et Haman. Haman promoted him. And in its parallel voice, he has fallen down before the queen. V'Haman nofel al hamita. Haman was lying prostrated on the couch. That's another story I have for another day. Okay. All right. That's a different story. On the couch on which Esther reclined. All right. I'm not sure where I'm going to teach that, but somewhere along the line. In E, it's Mordecai's refusal to bow down to Haman that incites Haman's plot to kill the Jews. In E prime, it is when Haman falls down before Esther that he seals his own fate. There could be some irony playing out here as well, intentionally. Chapter 3 begins with Haman being his seat being raised above all the other princes. In chapter 7, it concludes with Haman literally being raised above everyone else as he's impaled on a 75-foot spike. All right, E. I hope I don't make any more goofs like that. That was great. Number 7, F and F prime. In F, Haman, angered by Mordecai's refusal to rise before him, comes before the king to request that the Jews be destroyed. In F prime, Haman has once again been angered by Mordecai's refusal, this time to stand, and he again comes to the king, this time to request the death of Mordecai. This time, however, Haman is never allowed to present his request and instead is ordered to honor Mordecai. In chapter 3, Haman has the lots, the Purim, cast before him, going first through each day, then through each month, until the proper day was identified for the Jews' destruction. In chapter 6, the insomniac king has the book of remembrance of deeds of the days brought before him with the events of each day read to him until the account of Mordecai is recounted. In both of these episodes, and these episodes only, Haman gives advice to the king. Haman's first petition results in a public proclamation declaring the destruction of the Jews. In another ironic twist and a reversal, his second petition results, instead of a public proclamation, honoring Mordecai. In 315, the king's decree goes out in haste, the root being dachaf. In 6:2, it is Haman who runs out in haste. In chapter 3, haratzim yatzu, the couriers went out post haste on the royal mission. And then Haman hurries home after he discovers things aren't going so well, his head covered in mourning. A further sense of irony is found at the end of each of these scenes. In chapter 3, the order is issued to utterly destroy the Jews. In chapter 6, Haman is told by his wife, you will not be able to prevail over the Jews. And you have those verses there in 13. And finally, as what could be expected, both scenes end with a feast. All right, G and G prime. They both begin with Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. They each focus on an interchange between a male and female character. And that may not seem insignificant, but you have to realize there's not a lot of that going on in the Bible. In both cases, the male presents his complaint. In chapter 4, Mordecai complains about Haman's decree to kill the Jews. In chapter 5, Haman complains about Mordecai's continued existence. In each case, the woman then turns around and tries to present a solution. But there are several striking reversals between the scenes as well. Scene G opens with Mordecai going out in mourning and bitterness. And you can see in text 14, Vayetze, and Mordecai went out through the city crying out loudly and bitterly. And G prime, Vayetze Haman, Haman went out happy and lighthearted. Couple more in terms of this chiasm. As we continue through scene G, the narrator describes the grief and the humiliation of the Jews. In G prime, we read of the pride and exaltation of Haman. You have here Avel Gadim, and this sense of sadness is in this verse. When we get to this verse, and just to make the point, when we get to the reading of this verse in Esther, we chant it with the melodies of Echa, of Lamentations. And there was great mourning among the Jews, and there's a typo in the Hebrew I found this morning. Avel Gadol Yehudim v'tzom u'v'chi umis paid. It's weeping and wailing. It's not umis par numbers. I apologize for the typo. You can see I typed the whole thing, so there's your error. Great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and everybody in sackcloth and ashes. And then in 5, and Haman told them about his great wealth and his many sons, and about all about how the king had promoted him. In G, there are 2 references to the Jews fasting. The fast connected to the dialogue between Esther and Mordecai, and then that which Esther anticipates for the days to come. In G prime, there are 2 feasts that figure prominently: the feast that preceded Haman's meeting with his wife, and the feast he anticipates coming the next day. And we come now to the central verse, what is known as the hinge in a chiasm. It appears that this scene marks the true moment of crisis in the entire tale. Esther is about to appear before the king without an invitation. If he decides to kill her, we're done. So, that's the end of the story. All right. If he allows her to survive and to live, we've got a story that goes on. Well, you can imagine we get B as the option. It is here that the reversal truly begins. Haman will no longer be the hunter. He now becomes the hunted. This hinge has connections to the material both at the beginning and the end of the narrative. It is something of an ironic twist that at the end, opening scene of B, Vashti refuses to come when bidden to the king's feast. She's asked to come and she refuses to come, and she incurs the king's wrath. Here, Esther comes unwelcomed, uninvited to the presence of the king, and she receives his favor instead. All right, comments on the chiastic nature of this text. Ken, I see you unmuted.
Yes, so I was debating if I wanted to be the first. So I'll jump in here. Clearly, it's a literary device. It's not used only here, it's used in many places. And as you talked about the pivot, there's a transition moment where it goes from the world is falling apart to something happens and that changes the course of history.
Right.
Take that and overlay onto it the concept of feasting and fasting. And you mentioned earlier that there is no mention of God in this story. I have an assumption that the fast is a way of petitioning God as a society and people. So I'm thinking, is this story in essence a story of we can celebrate all the wonders that were provided with wine and food, but if we don't celebrate it, the goodness that we have, we need to understand that life, all those things come, the source of that is God. And so you've got this, whether or not it's real or not, these people who are living in such a way that it's constant feasting and celebration, and another people basically saying that can easily be overthrown if you don't honor God through the proper method like fasting and whatever. Is there anything in there?
So yeah. So look, and by the way, that, and for those of you who don't know, that's my brother Ken. I do, again, I believe this text, I don't believe this to be a historical fact. And so, yes, I believe, if you go back to the point that the author is trying to make, one of the things he's trying to do is show you the etiology of the meaning of why we celebrate this feast, as opposed to why it may have been celebrated in the past. It was just as commonplace behavior. And so I do think that there's lots of messages that can be pulled, and that's certainly one of them. And I am of the belief that most of these kinds of practices that we engage in religious life, and not just as Jews, but as Christians as well, are pre-existing patterns in which new meaning is superimposed. And so I do think you're getting at a point that is one of the lessons to be pulled from the author's intent of this text.
Mark?
Yes.
It's Aaron.
Yes.
So do we have any clues as to when chiastic literature developed, where it developed?
I'm going to have to leave that to somebody like Peter Gingas, all right, for whom that's an expertise I do not know.
Okay, thank you.
All right. We'll pull a few lessons out of this, but what I wanted you to see in terms of the chiasm is a deliberate structuring of a book, okay, that is using literary devices, parallel use of words, feasting and fasting, reversals very deliberately. You don't find that in most of the Bible stories. But for sure, to me, what that says is if there's any question as to this is the list of historical events as they happen, it's not. We know from some of the archaeology that the descriptions of the palace and some of the things they found do match what is being described in the text. But that doesn't necessarily mean the events of the story are accurate. It means the setting was accurate. Okay? And it's probably being written within 100 or 200 years of when these events theoretically happened. And so the person would know that information. I want to look at one more thing, a couple more things. All right. So that's the chiastic structure. I now want to look at the Septuagint. Sometime around the 3rd century before the Common Era, when the book of Esther was translated into Greek, clearly concerned with the lack of religious tone of the Hebrew text, another author adds a lot more material. The Septuagint story of Esther has substantial extra sections than the book of Esther in our Bible. In this, you have the story in the Septuagint begins with a dream of Mordecai, which sets up the danger and the conflict. The letters of the kings mentioned in the Hebrew text are written out in full in the Greek version. 2 prayers are added, and we're going to look at one in a second. A prayer that is given by Mordecai and a prayer given by Esther. And by the way, as Ken pointed out, there's no mention of prayer. The only thing we have is the fasting, which is in a sense a petition of God, but there's no verbiage. We have no wording that goes with it. In Septuagint, you have 2 prayers that do show up. In the Septuagint, Esther's approach of the king is portrayed in further and more exciting detail. And then at the end, there's an extra conclusion, just in case you missed all the religious content. So let's look at a couple of those things. Esther's prayer in the Septuagint. She begins in traditional fashion. She addresses God with praise. Brachot, you're great, you're wonderful. Gee, God, your hair smells terrific. God is not only Lord, but God is the only king. Mind you, who's this coming from? Esther, married to the king. You are the only king. The power of Achashverosh is temporary and limited. You, God, are the only one who can save. She then goes on and recalls the age-old history of God's relationship with Israel and relies on God's continued faithfulness to those promises. This should echo to you the beginning of the Amidah. Baruch atah, all right? Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu, God and God of our ancestors, and you are the Magen, you are the shield, you are the protector. All right? She structured it much the ways the rabbis ultimately structured the Avot. She then turns to the responsibilities of the people, and she notes how the people have venerated the gods of the Persians. Now, we have no mention of real idol worshiping. There's a lot of assumptions about that in the book of Esther. We don't know what the people are doing wrong. Okay? It says that they've missed the mark. We don't know. Here in the Septuagint, it's clear. They're worshiping the Persian gods. Esther is not shy. She turns around and says to God, here's what you got to do, God. Like Moses, Esther reminds God that the annihilation of the Jewish people will mean the end of praise of God. God, you lose. She also warns that the destruction of the Jews will be a victory for the worthless gods of the Persians and for their mortal king. All right, same arguments. You don't want people to say you couldn't, God. Your reputation is at stake. In the spirit of the psalm, she brazenly asked God to do what God has. Live up to your word. What kind of God are you? You need to save the chosen people. You need to be a Magen because that's what you told us you were going to be. This is not shy. This is chutzpah. At the end of her prayer, she makes a final plea. She begs God in the name of her people, hear us, save us. Her people are in mortal danger and doomed to die. They too are crying out for help. Only you, God, can rescue them. None of this is to be found in the book of Esther. It's found in the Septuagint. Second, I'm sort of looking for hands and I don't see any. Okay. Second, we know a little bit about her story of how she approaches the king unbidden. All right. What we hear in the Septuagint is she fasts for 3 days. She prays as she did passionately to God. Now she must face the king, even if it costs her life. Per the Septuagint, however, she dresses splendidly. She summons 2 maids to go with her as companions, and she sets out with courage. Upon her arrival, the king, not knowing who it is initially, adorned in all his majestic, looks up at this intruder with fiery anger. Esther faints. Now remember, she's been fasting for 3 days. That's not hard to believe, all right? She faints, and immediately the king realizes who it is. He leaps up to comfort and reassure the queen. It is Esther's courage and her brave actions that save the Jewish people. God's people are threatened with a massacre in this story, and now they are encouraged to attack their enemies, and there is still a massacre. The difference is it's their enemies who get decimated. You can see all sorts of underlying themes here. I'm open to questions and comments thus far, if there are any. Andy, you must have something to say. I've never known that you wouldn't.
I do, but it goes back, when you were talking about the chiastic structure. Chiastic structures are very common throughout the Torah. Lots of episodes. They often are in book length, but
Right.
there are lots of places where it exists, and it's a literary style. But what I'm wondering is why you or why scholars find that to be meaningful. It's a way of composing a story. Nowadays, we have different ways of composing a story, but I suppose if one analyzed Hamlet deeply enough, you might find, evidence of chiastic structures there as well. So lots of Jewish scholars have talked about this a lot. Why is it meaningful?
Look, I can give you my response to that. It doesn't mean it's
I
accurate.
don't want your response. I want the right answer.
All right. Well, then we do have a problem. So look, I agree with you. Most of the time when you find these kinds of things, when they explain a chiasm, they'll often explain it as A, B, B, A. It's usually pretty simplistic. The level to which it shows up in the book of Esther is what makes it distinct. And in so, it clearly to me says that this is not even meant to be historic. It is meant to be portrayed as events through a literary device that is conveying other messages other than historical accuracy. To me, that's the significance here. That's how I interpret it. Is that unfair?
I don't know if it's unfair. It is what it is. Most of the book of Vayikra is of chiastic structure. It's one of the largest chiastic units in the Torah. And Jacob Milgram makes a whole big deal about this in his analysis. And I've often wondered, okay, so that's, literature is interesting and we study literature because it's interesting, but is it meaningful? And, does it mean more than the author was being very literary and clever?
And it could be. These all we're presenting are, because for sure, traditionalists would slap me in the face right off the bat. None of this is relevant. All right. And so it's not usually in anything in life, it's not either or, it's a continuum along the way. And so where you see how much historic accuracy, how much is literary device, what the intent of the author is, I'm not sure I can give that to you here. I can point out some of the issues of the text as I've shown you, all right? And then say, we all have to walk away from this with our own interpretation. Sarah, I see you raising your hand.
This is off the wall random and may not be appropriate, but I was thinking about this story versus the story of Passover, because the story of Passover, we're reminded not to celebrate when people die.
Right.
Even if they're not our people and they were trying to kill us, we shouldn't celebrate. And that in Purim, it's the other thing. I mean, there was a great massacre. It just wasn't our people. They were trying to kill us and we killed them, but we have massive celebration. I thought that was interesting.
Well, you know what? If you look at Passover, we do celebrate. We do. The extent of here's how we take the celebration out of it. All right, think about the following. We take a little bit of wine and we dip it out of our cups of joy. and we do 3/4 of Hallel. The rest of it is one big celebration.
Okay.
So again, it's a matter of degree.
Can't hear Levine.
Yes, Ed, and then Jerry.
Okay, my question about this has always been, when the Tanakh was redacted, they threw out stories they didn't like. Here, the rabbis had real problems with this, but they kept it. You know, why did they keep this and not about the Maccabees? I mean, I've never understood that.
So the Maccabees, I can give you some sense of.
Yeah.
You know, look, all I can tell you is the discussion happens in the Talmud as to whether or not this should be included in the Mishnah. And on the reality of it is, it probably had I know Akiva supported it. It probably had the right people saying yes.
Okay.
All right? I can't tell you that for a fact, but I know, you look at those kinds of things, and it probably has to do with, you have an argument in Congress. Who gets up and says what matters? In the case of Hanukkah, think of what Hanukkah is. Hanukkah is a celebration of the rededication of the temple, correct?
Yeah.
When is the Mishnah being written? After the destruction of the temple. They're not looking to play up the celebration of a rededication of a temple at that point. They're uncomfortable with the messages that play out. Now, I can't tell you that's the absolute reason, but on a historical level, there's a logic there.
Okay, that was my feeling too.
Yes, Jerry, and then Ken, and then Sandra. Yeah.
All right. So I'm referring to something you raised earlier, which I was confused about. You said that initially that the Jews went out and destroyed Haman's family and all the supporters of Haman, as I understand.
Mm-hmm.
Did they take you said that there were no spoils taken by them. Is that really that they just killed people and they didn't take any of their belongings as they, as was done in other when Jews overcame other groups of people?
At least that's what the text conveys. And again, when they're killing people here, they're killing within their own community. It's not necessarily, usually when spoils are taken, it's when you wipe out another community. These are people living within their own. I can't tell you that's the reason, but there are some distinctions there, but they don't take the spoils per the text.
All right. Second question is, why would they substitute the word noose for the word stake? I don't understand
it's not there. It just says, and they were hung. That's all it says. It doesn't say stake. That's the point. What does that mean?
Okay.
And again, I'm giving you some historical interpretation of it by a number of writers I've come across. Well, not everybody's going to agree, but the intent is, again, who hangs somebody 75 feet in the air?
Right. But
unless you want them,
75 feet.
Right, you want them visible.
Impalement was the standard method of execution in the Persian Empire.
That's all. That's correct.
History.
Okay.
So,
thank you.
it was very messy.
I bet.
Ken, and then Sandra. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to play off of Andy's comment a little bit about the literary device. First, because I do wonder, so what? It's a great way of telling a story. And maybe there is something in there. It's just telling a story, and you get the foreboding of what's going to happen. You get that hinge, as you call it, or pivot that transforms it. That's interesting. So you can think about it from that. But the other thing is, I'm not sure it fully invalidates any historical reference. I think of modern world where we've got the play Hamilton. Clearly there's a literary device going on there, that rap is being used to tell a historic story, and there is some creativity involved, but that doesn't negate the historical components of it. So it could be both.
Yeah. So this would probably along those lines, I would say this: if it more resembles historical fiction than history. Okay. You know me. I read a lot, and I've been reading a lot of Margaret George's texts on historical fiction. All right, I've read about Napoleon. I've read about a whole series of different characters. And if you go through the book and you sit with your iPad, you're going to find historical realities within the text. But you're also going to find a lot of creativity. Okay, Sandra.
So remind us when the Septuagint was, I guess, codified or mostly written, because we're talking about, a different society that was, from when this was supposedly composed and, mostly written down. I mean, we all know that things change as over every culture that we took our literature to, right?
Right. So again, we're not 100% sure when Esther was written, but the general assumption is because it was being written for a particular audience in a particular time, meaning the Persians at the end, probably towards the end of Persian rule, the Septuagint was probably written within 100 years of that.
So we're talking about what years
Third
again?
century before the Common Era.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so they had between the time when they took this to the next, Greek place we went? Was
Right.
it?
Well,
Yeah.
the Greeks are those who conquered the Persians.
Right. So this is the Seleucids that are the Seleucid Greeks that we know from the other one?
Was the Ptolemies.
The Ptolemies.
Okay.
The Septuagint was written for the Jewish community that was living in Alexandria.
Alexandria, okay.
And it was written in Greek, and Greek was, you should pardon the expansion, was the lingua franca of the ancient world of that period.
Right. So
Thank you.
it was somewhere around 100 to 200 years later around then?
I don't think it's more than 100.
Okay. I was just trying to get the cultural kind of shift that we're talking about between, time A when we really think about Purim and what the reason was behind this story being kept, right? For so many years. I mean, until today, 2000 years later. So, I thought it was really interesting and thank you. I learned a lot.
Are there any other hands? Yes, Andy.
Just a different thought from a completely different direction. There is scholarship that suggests the basic story of Esther was a pre-existent Persian story, that even the names Mordecai and Esther are very similar to the Persian name God and God.
Marduk and Ishtar.
Marduk and Ishtar. And that, the innovation of what became the book of Esther in the Bible was that it was translated to reflect Jewish characters and placed in a historic period where it was probably an ancient Persian story.
Yeah.
And certainly you can see that its story value, the idea that the king was stupid, and had these antics and a year-long party, it is hard to place that in whatever era you're living in. But talking about the good old days, yeah, they partied for half a year way back then. Didn't they know how to have fun? What happened to us? So it was a mythological story, updated, made Jewish, with very little addition of Jewish content. Jews, the main characters became Jewish, and the good guys and bad, the good guys became Jewish. Everything else could have stayed the same. And in many ways, that accounts for why it's such an un-Jewish story. That it's about revenge, that it's about, lots, it's about chance, it's about revert. I mean, what makes Esther so much fun for us is it's such an un-Jewish story.
So and then Sandra.
Also that it has a happy ending. Jewish stories don't ever have a happy ending.
Right, exactly. So, look, this technique of using something that previously existed is not uncommon. I just listened to a lecture by Shai Held in which he talks about the psalm that we all sing, Havul Adonai B'nai Elim, was an ancient pagan psalm that all they did essentially was put the word Adonai in instead of the ancient gods that were believed. We borrowed from the previously existing and superimposed new meaning. I think that's pretty common. Yes, indeed. So I agree with what you're saying. Yes, Sandra.
Yeah, so just for some other modern commentary, if you're interested, there was a book that won I think it's a Jewish book award called The Book of Thee for Vashti by Anna Solomon. It's a fiction book, and it goes back from, today, modern, the story of how women are hidden but liberated, and it also has an ancient part to it. And it's also got the author, if you go to Hadassah Brandeis Institute, you can hear a lecture by the author that she gave a couple of years ago when the book first came out. So it is still a story that has been interpreted, and it is a very Jewish story, I think, unlike Andy, because, we've for thousands of years lived among people who want to persecute us. So what is not Jewish about that? Right?
Okay, so
the Egyptians on. So, this is just another one of those stories where they tried to kill us, they didn't, and let's eat. So
Right.
let's
It's
celebrate.
clearly culturally Jewish in terms of how the author is presenting it. You are missing all of the religious components of it, and that's why the Septuagint corrected it as they saw it.
Right.
They saw the lackings within. The rabbis played with it because they saw the lackings within. Is it Jewish? Yes, but again, defining what Jewish means that's question two, and you can go in lots of different directions.
Right. So I find a lot of Jewish meaning in this story. I have since I was a kid, and even, like I said, the Book of the modern interpretations, we're still interpreting it.
Yeah. And the women's issue plays out here, and as well as in the Book of Ruth. You see both societies in which women are demeaned and both societies in which women take some kind of active role.
Right.
And Sandra,
You can interpret it any way you want. Rona.
oh, she's speaking, the author's speaking through as part of that Vashti banquet at the
I'm
jail.
putting it in the chat right now, Ron.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. To be fair to everybody's time, I'm seeing I've already gone about 10 minutes over. I want to thank you all for joining us. Please join us for Purim. All right. We look forward to seeing everybody. And bring your noisemakers.
Yep, we'll have to provide our own drinks.
There you go.
First Purim with mute buttons.
That's
Right.
Yes, indeed. Richard, I love seeing you.
I enjoy this so much and I miss it. It's been a long time. I'll be back.
Indeed. Thank you. All right. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.